Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to be working on the lights for the little Heng Long truck. First we're going to need access to the electronics. There's two screws up front that attach the bumper to the chassis. We take those out and slide it off, which frees up the front of the cab. At the rear, next to the boxes, there's two more screws, one per side. They come out and the cab lifts away from the chassis. Next we've got the two screws for the battery tray. And with them out, we can move the tray out of the way, but not too far because we tape the antenna onto the side. Now, to run the lights, we could just plug them into a spare slot on the receiver and have them on all the time, but that's no fun. The current full-blown light controller would work, but it's far too big. There's just not enough room for it under the battery tray. I did put together a mini controller using one of those little development boards. It was great on the bench, but the first time I powered it up, the motor played its little tune. And yep, that's dead. You can see the moment the LED stops flashing. So rather than try using someone else's dev board again, I've started from scratch and come up with this little guy. Okay, it's not so little, but it is a prototype. The final board will be around the size of the larger green subboard. It's sized so it should just about fit on top of the receiver next to the servo connectors. For now though, the prototype's going to have to live in the bed. There's plenty of space back there, and more importantly, it's going to allow access so I can test the firmware. Right now, it can only do the headlights and the brake lights. The final version will have a couple of aux channels for things like roof lights, some effects like strobing headlights, and of course the reversing light. The only things missing from its bigger brother are the indicators and the expansion port. I think it's a fair compromise for the much smaller size. To get it working, we need to plug the servo lead into the throttle channel on the receiver. The single lead plugs into the signal pin on channel 3 so we can select which lights we want. And the ESC then just plugs into the light controller. For the lights themselves, I soldered this up to fit the cab to replace the stock white LEDs. It's just two 5mm whites and two resistors under the heat shrink. It just plugs straight into the headlight socket on the board. For the tail lights, I've made up a little test lead. It's got a red LED and a resistor. We'll have to make something else to fit onto the model, but it'll do for a quick test. The final board will have some solder pads along one edge rather than sockets to save space. On these small models, every bit of space is precious, so getting rid of the bulky connectors is a must. Now we can connect up the battery and turn on the ESC. Now I've not got the transmitter turned on yet, so you can see the light controller happily dealing with it. The green LED is blinking 3 times, saying there's no signal on channel 3, the aux channel. The FlySky radios, like most of them, output a signal on channel 2, the throttle, even when the transmitter's turned off, to make sure the ESC or throttle servo is in a fail-safe position. When the transmitter does get turned on, we get a signal on channel 3, so the light controller flashes quickly for a second or two while it finds the neutral points. The green LED goes out and the brake lights come on, so it's up and running. The brake lights go out when the motor runs, forward or back, as you might expect. To change the lighting mode, I've set up one of the rockers on the radio to act as a center-stable 3-position momentary switch. Not many radios can actually do this, so I'm going to try something clever to detect a more common on-off switch for setting the lights. Just for fun, when you go one more mode past full headlights, they start strobing. There's an interesting interference pattern with the camera going on there, but you get the idea. It's a bit of an attention getter. Right then, with all that out the way, we can start the proper install. First job is to pull it apart again. Remove the ESC from the controller and the two leads going to the receiver. Unplug the battery and flip the truck over. We're going to need to install some LEDs in those fake rear lights and fit a reversing light too. To remove the brace, we're going to need to remove the bed. There's two small self-tappers to take out. They seem to be made of some sort of metallic cheese, so we need to be a bit careful with them. With the bed gone, we can now remove the screws that attach the leaf mounts. There's one per side. Gently open out the chassis rails and pop out the leaf mounts. They have a little hook on one end that keeps them in position. And now we can slide out the brace with the lights. This might be a toy truck, but there's been an awful lot of thought in the design. They've really done a lot to keep the parts count down. To fit the LEDs, rather than just drill a 3mm hole and poking them out, which would work, but looks a bit naff, we're going to drill and countersink from the outside. Hopefully there's enough thickness in the plastic we'll be able to get a bit of a light bulb. You could do this with a separate drill and countersink too. The main thing is getting the initial hole right in the centre. And there we go then. I think they came out rather well. It would be nice to have some lenses on them too, but perhaps that's one step too far. For the reverse light, I'm just going to drill a hole and leave the LED sticking out. It's not ideal, but it's not going to be a focal point like the tail lights, so I think it's going to look okay. Right, here's the brace with all its bits fitted and connected up. We've got the 3mm white reverse LED poking out to one side, 3 resistors all well insulated in heat shrink, there's one per LED, and there's 3 wires coming out the back. Orange is the common line that takes 5 volts, blue is the ground for the tail lights, and yellow is the ground for the reverse light. Because all the plastic bits are hollow, it's really quite easy to make the install look nice and tidy. To get the wires up to the front, we could just run them between the neck chassis brace and the bed, as there's a small gap, but I think it's going to be neater if we drill some holes to run the wires through the brace. If nothing else, it's going to keep the wiring in place during partial dismantles of the truck. To get the brace out, there's 1 screw per side to hold the front leaf mounts on. Remove them, gently spread the chassis rails, and the mounts will come free. Move the axle out of the way and slide the brace out. Now all we need to do is drill a hole. For the size of the wires, I'm using 3mm, which seems about right. Not too tight, it's difficult to get the wires through, but also not so big it's going to make the brace weak. I did come up against one little problem though. I managed to drill straight through the plastic and into the end of my finger. I was thinking at the time, you're going to drill a hole in your finger, and then I did. So we're going to have to finish this up with a plaster. Putting it back together is more or less the reverse of taking it apart. The only addition is threading the wires through the brace. We'll trim them to length when we know how long they're going to need to be. It's a lot easier to trim them once rather than have to splice a bit more in later. The braces slide in, and with the rails gently separated, the leaf mount should clip into place too. Fit the screws, all loosely at first, and then tighten them up, being very careful not to strip them. Reinstall the bed with its 2 screws and flip the chassis over. We'll need the wires from the rear lights to end up where the receiver is, as that's where the final board's going to sit. So we'll twist them up and clip them with a nice bit to spare so they're all ready to go. The ESC's lead isn't quite going to reach the prototype controller, so we'll just use a short extension lead for now. Not the neatest, but this is just until the new boards arrive. For now, I've soldered a 3-pin connector to the rear lights. The centre pin is common, so if it's plugged in backwards, the worst that's going to happen is the reverse and tail lights will be swapped. I've also soldered some longer leads to the prototype for the headlights and radio to make up for it being mounted so far away. We can plug the controller into the radio right away, the 3-pin into the throttle channel, and the single into channel 3 signal pin. Refit the battery tray with its 2 screws, being very careful not to trap anything. That'll keep some of the wires tidy and out of the way while we do another quick test. We can plug the headlights into the headlight port, the tail lights into the tail light port, and the ESC into the light controller. Plug in the battery with the radio on, turn on the ESC and see what happens. Well, the radio works, but all is not quite right at the back. The reverse light is on with the throttle at neutral. All that means is the connector's backwards, so if we swap that round it should all just work. Yep, that's looking pretty good. You'll note the reverse light isn't coming on yet. That's because the firmware that controls it hasn't actually been written, but I'll get to that before we do the last test. Okay, headlights next. Inside the cab there's 2 5mm LEDs clipped in place. We removed the wires in the first video, which was just a case of heating up the legs with a soldering iron. Removing the LEDs themselves is a bit more of a faff. You could just grab them with some pliers and pull, but you'd most likely damage the clips. I found if you rotate the LED, so the flat on the cathode side of the flange is in line with the clip, you can just about persuade them to pop out. You have to push them from the outside and lift from the inside. The new LEDs are already wired up, so they just need pressing in. The wires will run down the side of the battery tray, and when the final board's fitted, they'll go up under the back of the tray to where the board sits. For now though, they will just run straight out the back. With all that wiring coming out around the motor, it's a bit of a tight fit, and requires a fair bit of jiggling to get it all down so nothing gets pinched. With the final board, it's only going to be the rear lights and the motor wires, so there should be plenty of space. With the bumper and screws refitted, we're almost ready for another test run. but first it will be a good idea to attach the prototype to the bed so it's not just flapping around in the breeze. There's no need for anything special, just a strip of servo tape will do the job. Stuff the excess wire down in the gap between the bed and the cab, and we're ready for another test run. Okay, battery installed and plugged in, the transmitter's on, so we can turn on the ESC. Okay, headlights, they seem okay, and the tail lights, well, they're working too, nice. Just a firmware to update to get the reverse light working now, and for that test, instead of using a 5-cell NiCad, I've got a little LiPo. It's an 800 mAh 2S pack. This particular one is available from Component Shop here in the UK. It's one of the few packs I found that's thin enough to fit within the height of the battery tray. Most are 3 or 4 millimeters thicker, making them not quite fit. I'm sure there's other packs around too, but this one's going to do the job quite nicely. With it all plugged in, we can now see when going backwards the reverse light comes on too. So that's working. Just one more thing to do this week, take it outside for a proper test run. It's going to be a few weeks before the new PCBs arrive, so there's most likely going to be a bit of a gap before the next B1 video. With any luck, next week we'll actually be at the London Model Engineering Expo. So we'll have some video of the Tamiya trucking layout and anything else that might be ever so slightly vaguely related to RC. It's always a fun show to go to, especially for materials and tools where you can get a feel for what you're buying, something you just can't really do with online ordering. So that's really it for this week now. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, a like is always much appreciated. Subscribe if you don't want to miss the next exciting instalment, and comment if you've got something on your mind. Thanks for watching. Bye guys.